September 1944. Europe was on fire, but the Allies believed the end was close. After smashing through France and Belgium, their armies now stood at the doorstep of Germany. The dream was clear: finish the war by Christmas. Yet the enemy was far from broken, and supplies were stretched thin across hundreds of miles. Amid this uncertainty, British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery proposed a plan so bold it could either end the war in weeks or destroy thousands of men in days. Its name was Operation Market Garden, a daring attempt to capture a chain of bridges across the Netherlands, leading straight into Germany's industrial heart. The plan was simple on paper. American and British paratroopers would drop deep behind enemy lines, seize the bridges, and hold them until ground forces, the British XXX Corps, could race up a single highway to link up with them. If all went right, the Allies would cross the Rhine, bypass the Siegfried Line, and bring the war to an early end. But war, as history has taught us, rarely goes according to plan. Among those bridges stood one that would decide the operation's fate: the twin bridges at Nijmegen over the river Waal. Whoever controlled them would control the only path into Germany. To seize them was the task of America's elite 82nd Airborne Division under Brigadier General James Gavin, a man known for leading from the front. His paratroopers were veterans hardened by Sicily and Normandy, and among them was Lieutenant Colonel Ben Vandervoort, commander of the 2nd Battalion, 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, a leader as fearless as he was relentless. On the morning of September 17th, the skies over Holland filled with the thunder of hundreds of planes. One by one, thousands of paratroopers jumped, their parachutes blossoming like white petals against a steel-gray sky. Beneath them stretched a landscape of rivers, dikes, and villages, peaceful for centuries, but about to become one of the deadliest battlegrounds of the war. As the paratroopers hit the ground, chaos unfolded. German flak ripped through the air, scattering units far from their drop zones. Radios crackled, shouts echoed across the fields. Yet within hours, small groups began forming up, loading their weapons and pushing toward their objectives. Their orders were clear: secure the high ground at Groesbeek and move on Nijmegen. But what they didn't know was that two battle-hardened SS Panzer divisions were resting nearby, quietly refitting after months of fighting on the Eastern Front. The Allied plan had overlooked them completely. By the time the Americans approached Nijmegen, the Germans were ready. The city's narrow streets, once quiet and lined with red brick houses, now hid snipers, machine guns, and mortar positions. Every corner could be death. Vandervoort's men advanced house by house, trading bullets for inches. Tanks from the British XXX Corps joined them, rumbling through alleys barely wide enough for their tracks. The sound of tank shells echoed through the city as soldiers shouted over the roar of battle. Civilians huddled in cellars praying the fighting would pass, while smoke rose in thick black clouds above the rooftops. As the sun began to fall, the cost of the day became clear. The Americans had pushed deep into Nijmegen, but the vital bridges still stood in German hands. Vandervoort knew that without those bridges, Market Garden would fail before it even crossed the Rhine. The men dug in for the night, exhausted, hungry, and surrounded by the thunder of distant artillery. They had fought bravely, but this was only the beginning. Tomorrow they would face something even worse: a desperate assault across the wide, deadly waters of the River Waal itself. The fate of the entire operation, perhaps even the war, would soon rest on the shoulders of a few hundred men, willing to risk everything to capture those bridges before it was too late. The next morning, the city of Nijmegen woke to a nightmare. Smoke still hung over the rooftops, and the sound of machine guns echoed through empty streets. The 82nd Airborne had fought their way deep into the city, but the bridges, their true prize, still lay beyond reach. Every road leading to them was barricaded, mined, and crawling with German troops who knew exactly what was at stake. The Americans had been ordered to take the bridges intact, but the Germans had no intention of letting that happen. The fight for Nijmegen was about to turn into one of the most brutal street battles of the entire war. Van der Voort's men pushed forward, inch by inch, through the narrow Dutch streets. Every house was a fortress. Every window hid a sniper. The air smelled of smoke, brick dust, and cordite. Civilians who had survived the first day now hid in basements, their faces pale from fear and dust. Above them, paratroopers exchanged fire with Germans only meters away, often separated by a single wall. It wasn't war as the generals imagined it. It was chaos, intimate, personal, and merciless. At one corner, a group of American soldiers crouched behind a blown-out truck, trying to cross an intersection swept by enemy fire. A machine gun rattled from an upstairs window. A tank shell slammed into the building, sending bricks flying like shrapnel. Dust filled the air, and through it the soldiers sprinted forward, shouting and firing as they ran. Somewhere ahead, a young paratrooper named John Steele, barely 20, tripped over the body of his friend. He paused for a second, then kept running. There was no time to mourn. Not yet. By midday, the British armor of XXX Corps finally reached the edge of the city. Relief flooded through the Americans. At last, the tanks had arrived. But victory was still far away. The bridges stood across the wide Waal River, and the Germans were dug in deep on the far bank. They had turned the bridges into fortresses, bristling with machine guns and anti-tank guns. Anyone who tried to cross would be cut down instantly. The only way left was madness, an assault across the river itself. The idea came from Colonel Tucker of the 504th Parachute Infantry. He proposed sending men across the Waal in small canvas boats, under direct fire, to attack the German positions from the other side. It sounded insane, suicidal even, but there was no other option. Van der Voort's battalion was exhausted, running low on ammunition, but orders were orders. Reinforcements from the 504th were gathered, their faces grim but determined. As one officer said, "If we don't take that bridge, Market Garden dies here." The Waal River was no calm stream. Nearly 400 meters wide, with a strong current, it was an open killing ground. And yet, in the late afternoon, under the cover of a smokescreen, the boats were brought forward. Small, fragile, and made of canvas. They weren't built for combat, but they were all the men had. The paratroopers looked across the river and saw only smoke and flashes of gunfire. Somewhere out there on the far side lay the bridge that could decide the fate of thousands. The plan was simple but deadly. Half the men would paddle across, seize a foothold and hold it while the others followed. British tanks and artillery would cover them from this side of the river. But everyone knew the truth. No amount of fire could truly protect them out there on the water. It would be raw courage against raw firepower. As evening shadows stretched over Nijmegen, Van der Voort and his men watched the preparations in silence. They had fought for days through blood and fire, and now it all came down to this: a river, a bridge, and a chance to turn disaster into victory. Some prayed quietly. Others checked their rifles one last time. The boats waited at the water's edge, ready to carry them into history. The next morning the order would come. They would cross the Waal, or die trying. The morning of September 20th, 1944, broke with a thick gray mist hanging over the city of Nijmegen. The river lay wide and silent, a cold serpent twisting through smoke and fire. On its near bank, hundreds of paratroopers crouched in silence beside the fragile canvas boats that would carry them into history. They knew what awaited them: open water, German guns, and near certain death. Yet not one man backed away. The order was simple: cross the Waal, seize the far bank, and capture the bridges. It was the kind of mission that only the desperate or the brave could attempt. When the signal came, artillery thundered across the river. British guns opened up in a deafening roar, shells screaming overhead and crashing into the German positions on the far side. Smoke shells followed, creating a thick white curtain across the water. Behind that cover, the first wave of boats slid into the river. The paddles splashed quietly at first, then faster, stronger. Within seconds, the current caught them, dragging the men into open water. They paddled furiously, heads down, bullets slicing through the mist around them. The Germans had seen them now. Machine guns opened up from bunkers and rooftops, the rattle of their fire echoing like thunder. Men fell into the water, some hit, some trying to pull their wounded friends back into the boats. The current showed no mercy, dragging the living and the dead alike downstream. Yet somehow the others kept going. They shouted, cursed, and prayed as they paddled across that wide, deadly river. Sergeant Frank Statura of the 504th later said, "I never thought I'd make it halfway. But when I looked around, the boys were still going, so I just kept paddling." There was no time to think. Only survive. Only reach the other side. The smoke began to drift, revealing the German positions. Tracers tore across the water like fiery whips. Some boats were shredded completely. Men swimming the rest of the way under a rain of bullets. When the first survivors hit the far bank, they didn't wait for orders. Soaked, freezing, and half-deaf from the noise, they charged straight at the enemy. Grenades exploded in trenches. Rifles cracked at point-blank range. It was chaos, raw, violent, and unstoppable. The Americans fought like men possessed, clearing one position after another with bayonets and grenades. Behind them, more boats arrived, bringing reinforcements who threw themselves into the fight without hesitation. As the paratroopers secured a small foothold, British tanks on the near side of the river began firing in support. Shells slammed into German bunkers, tearing holes in their defenses. Slowly, painfully, the tide began to turn. Within an hour, the Americans had seized several hundred meters of riverbank. By afternoon, they were pushing toward the northern ends of the bridges. The Germans were stunned. They hadn't believed anyone could survive that crossing, let alone attack with such ferocity. In the streets leading to the bridges, the battle turned into a storm of metal and fire. British tanks rumbled forward, their tracks grinding over rubble. American paratroopers clung to their sides, firing at anything that moved. Together they fought block by block, smashing through resistance. At 6 p.m., with smoke filling the air and the city burning behind them, the first Allied troops reached the southern end of the road bridge. A single German truck, packed with explosives, tried to race across to blow it, but a tank shell hit it squarely, erupting into a fireball. The bridge stood, scarred but alive. As the sun set, a small group of exhausted paratroopers raised their rifles and looked across the steel arches of the Waalbrug. They had done the impossible. The bridge at Nijmegen was theirs. The cost had been horrific. Hundreds dead or wounded, the river still drifting with the bodies of brave men, but victory was undeniable. The road to Arnhem was open. For a moment it seemed the gamble of Market Garden might succeed after all, but even as the soldiers cheered, dark clouds gathered on the horizon. Arnhem still held, and British paratroopers there were fighting for their lives, waiting for help that might never come. The bridges at Nijmegen were taken, but the battle for the Rhine had only just begun. As Nijmegen burned behind them, the Allies turned their eyes north. Just 50 miles away across the broad Rhine, the British 1st Airborne Division was still holding out at Arnhem, isolated, outnumbered, and slowly being crushed. For days they had fought with impossible courage, waiting for relief that never came. Their radios crackled with broken messages, their ammunition was nearly gone, and every street had become a battlefield. Yet even now the men of the 1st Airborne refused to surrender. They had come to hold the bridge, and they would hold it until the end. When the first paratroopers had landed near Arnhem a week earlier, optimism had filled the air. Market Garden was supposed to end the war by Christmas. A bridge too far was just a phrase and not a prophecy. The Dutch had cheered the red-bereted soldiers as liberators, handing them flowers and waving flags. But by the second day, the cheers had turned to gunfire. German SS units, veterans of the Eastern Front, moved swiftly to seal off the town. They came with tanks, artillery, and ruthless efficiency. The British paratroopers, armed mostly with rifles and light weapons, were trapped before they even reached the bridge. At the bridge itself, Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's battalion made its stand. For 4 brutal days, Frost's men defended the northern end against waves of German attacks. They fought from ruined houses, firing through shattered windows and collapsing walls. The noise was relentless. Tanks rumbling, shells exploding, and the cries of the wounded echoing through the smoke. The bridge trembled under bombardment, and yet it held, just like the men who guarded it. They had no illusions left. Every bullet counted, every moment was borrowed time. Still, they held on. Back in Nijmegen, Allied commanders pushed desperately to reach Arnhem. The road north, the narrow Hell's Highway, was jammed with vehicles, wrecks, and constant ambushes. German reinforcements poured in from every direction. The plan that had seemed bold now looked impossible. Even as the paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne secured their sectors, the lifeline to Arnhem was choking under fire. Every hour lost meant more blood at the Rhine. By the 5th day, Frost's force at the bridge was surrounded. Ammunition was gone. Medics worked in candlelight, treating the wounded with rags and rainwater. The smell of smoke, sweat, and cordite filled the air. German loudspeakers called for surrender, but the British replied with rifle fire. Then came the final assault. Tanks rolled forward, smashing through the rubble. Buildings collapsed one after another. When the fighting finally stopped, the bridge lay in ruins. Frost and his remaining men were captured. Their resistance broken not by fear but by exhaustion. They had fought until nothing was left to fight with. Farther west, the rest of the division tried to hold a small pocket along the river. Rain poured down, turning the ground to mud. Supply drops missed their targets. Radios failed. The men were starving, cold, and soaked to the bone. And still, they refused to give up. When word finally came that they would be evacuated across the river, it felt less like rescue and more like retreat. Under cover of darkness, in small boats, the survivors slipped back across the Rhine, silent, defeated but unbroken. By the time it was over, more than 1,500 British soldiers were dead, and over 6,000 had been captured. Arnhem was lost. Operation Market Garden, the grand gamble to end the war early, had failed. The road to the Rhine remained closed, and the war would grind on for another 7 months. Yet among those who fought there, no one spoke of failure, only of courage, brotherhood, and sacrifice. They had gone farther than anyone believed possible, and though the bridge was lost, their spirit had crossed it long before their bodies ever could. When the guns finally fell silent over Arnhem, the city was a graveyard. Smoke drifted between the ruins, and the Rhine flowed dark and cold beneath the shattered bridge. The echoes of battle had faded, replaced by the quiet moans of the wounded and the crackle of fires devouring what was left. Dutch civilians emerged from cellars and basements, their faces pale with dust and disbelief. For days they had lived like ghosts, listening to the battle rage above them, praying that liberation was close. But when the smoke cleared, they saw only destruction, and the enemy's flag still flying. The men who survived the slaughter staggered through the ruins, dazed and hollow-eyed. Many had been hiding in broken houses or gardens, trying to avoid capture. Some were carried away by their Dutch helpers, farmers, priests, and women who risked their lives to shelter them. The Germans searched house by house, dragging out anyone who looked like a soldier. Dozens of civilians were shot for helping the British. Yet even in defeat, a quiet defiance filled the air. The people of Arnhem had seen true courage, and they would never forget it. Across the river, the remnants of the British 1st Airborne regrouped in silence. Their uniforms were soaked, their faces gaunt, and their eyes told stories that words never could. Commanders read the casualty reports in disbelief, entire battalions reduced to a handful of men. Vehicles lined the muddy riverbank, smashed or abandoned. The promise of victory, the dream of ending the war by Christmas, had vanished into the autumn mist. One officer whispered, "We were so close." So damn close. The Dutch, who had welcomed the Allies with flowers, now faced the cruel price of hope. After the failure of Market Garden, the Germans unleashed brutal reprisals. Villages suspected of helping the Allies were burned. Food supplies were cut off, leading to what history would remember as the Hunger Winter. Families starved in silence, eating tulip bulbs and bark to survive. For many, liberation would not come for another long, bitter year. And yet in their hearts they clung to the memory of those brave soldiers who had fallen for their freedom. In London, the mood was somber. Operation Market Garden had been hailed as a bold strike to end the war quickly, but it had become a lesson in the limits of ambition. General Montgomery, who had dreamed of crossing the Rhine in glory, now faced the reality of thousands of dead and captured men. In field hospitals across Belgium and England, wounded paratroopers stared at the ceiling, replaying the horror of Arnhem. Some blamed command, others blamed fate, but most simply stayed quiet, haunted by the faces of the men they left behind. Yet even in failure, there was pride. The soldiers who had fought at Arnhem had shown a courage that defied logic. They had held against impossible odds, fought street by street, and never surrendered until their weapons were gone and their strength spent. Their stand became legend, a story not of defeat but of endurance. In the years to come, veterans would return to that bridge, laying flowers where their friends had fallen. The Dutch would greet them with tears and gratitude, remembering the week when ordinary men became immortal. The bridge at Arnhem was rebuilt after the war. Today it stands quietly over the Rhine, its steel arches gleaming in the sun. Cars pass over it without knowing the ground beneath them once ran red with blood. But if you stand there at dusk when the light fades and the wind whispers across the water, you can almost hear them, the faint echo of gunfire, the shouted orders, the paddles striking the Waal, and the distant cry of men who refuse to give up. Arnhem may have fallen, but their story never did. Years passed and the guns of Europe fell silent. Cities rebuilt, nations healed, and the world moved on. But for the men who had fought at Arnhem, the memories never faded. They carried them quietly. The faces of lost friends, the smell of smoke, the cold sting of the river. Every September, as autumn returned, they felt that same chill in the air, and they remembered. Some returned to Arnhem, walking the same streets where they had once fought and bled. The bridge stood rebuilt, strong and proud, but to them it was never just steel and stone. It was a memorial, a promise that their sacrifice had meant something. For the veterans, Arnhem was more than a battle. It was a test of humanity itself. They remembered the Dutch civilians who had shared their last pieces of bread, the nurses who treated the wounded under fire, the children who whispered, "God bless you," as the paratroopers passed. They remembered the fear, yes, but also the brotherhood. In those 9 days of hell, rank and title meant nothing. Officers and privates fought side by side, carried each other through fire, and died together under the same flag. Decades later, when asked why they kept fighting even when all hope was gone, one survivor simply said, "Because the man next to me didn't stop." The world called Arnhem a failure. Historians analyzed the maps, the timings, the decisions that went wrong. They spoke of bridges lost and objectives missed. But the men who were there never used the word failure. To them, Arnhem was proof of what courage truly meant. To keep moving when you're broken, to hold your ground when logic says run, and to stand tall even when defeat is certain. They hadn't lost their honor. They had defined it. In the years that followed, the survivors aged, their hair turned white, their voices softened. But when they spoke of Arnhem, their eyes still burned with the same fire. They met each year in quiet ceremonies beside the river, placing wreaths where their friends had fallen. The Dutch stood beside them generations later, still grateful, still calling them liberators. School children carried their photos, lighting candles in the windows of old houses. The bridge was renamed John Frost Bridge in honor of the commander who had refused to yield. And on silent evenings, as the last rays of sun touched the water, the city seemed to whisper their names. Even those who never returned to Arnhem were haunted by its ghost. Some found peace, others never could. Many spoke of waking in the night, hearing again the roar of tanks, the cries from across the river, the whistle of bullets tearing through the mist. But amid the nightmares there was pride, quiet, unshakable pride. They had been part of something greater than themselves. They had fought not for glory or medals, but for each other. Today Arnhem stands in peace. Cafes line the riverbank. Bicycles cross the bridge and children play in the parks where soldiers once dug foxholes. Yet the memory endures, in the stories told, the monuments built, and the silence that falls every year on the anniversary of the battle. 'Cause Arnhem is not just a chapter in a history book. It is a reminder that bravery can outlive defeat and sacrifice can outshine victory. For the men of the 1st Airborne, the war ended long ago. But in Arnhem, in the wind that moves across the Rhine, in the quiet dignity of those who remember, they are still there, young, unbroken, and eternal.